Welcome to Civility and American Democracy, a national forum. Presented by the Center for Civil Discourse at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In partnership with Mass Humanities, WBUR Radio, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Moderating today's discussion, the host of WBUR's On Point, Tom Ashbrook.
Good morning. Welcome to a day-long discourse on civility and American democracy, civil discourse. We all know how absent it can be in our lives today. We all occasionally long for it. We all occasionally lapse in it ourselves. We're going to have a tremendous day today of thinking and sharing about this very important subject for our country, for our democracy. John Stouffer, we give the floor to you.
As many of you know, roughly 50% of Americans believe there's been a profound lack of civility in current public discourse, especially in political debates. And I agree with the recent decline in civility over the past 10 years or so. But I want to take a long view and explore how civility has evolved from really the antebellum period to the near present. One of the most memorable acts from the perspective of us today and from the perspective of Northerners in the 1850s of uncivil behavior in Congress. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, one of the most abolitionist congressmen at the time, was caned almost to death on the Senate floor in 1856. Now, what's significant here is that Northerners were absolutely outraged. It actually fueled the rise of the Republican Party. But Southerners considered Preston Brooks to be civil. Southerners showered Preston Brooks with congratulatory canes and silver platters. To this day, there are cities and counties named after Preston Brooks in South Carolina. You know, roughly 100 years later, this is a photograph from the journalist Charles Moore, who covered the civil rights movement for Life magazine. The context is the integration of University of Mississippi, and Governor Ross Barnett defined the federal court order trying to prevent James Meredith from enrolling. John F. Kennedy sent in National Guard, a riot ensued. The fact that you use violence as a way to destroy or to silence your enemy's barbarism and preserve civility is now unacceptable. The third example you're all probably familiar with is Joe Wilson's "You Lie" and Obama's 2009 congressional speech supporting health care. After the same day, Wilson apologized publicly. Then what happens is he receives $2 million in campaign contributions and he kind of backs off his apology. I mean, if you look at the Republicans versus liberal Democrats, the gap between them is huge. The greater the gulf, the more one needs to broaden that sphere of civility.
There's a challenging view from history already. John Stouffer, thank you very much. Randall Kennedy, please.
When is civility required? When is it not required? When would it be immoral to be civil? To quote one participant in these debates, Professor Robert George of Princeton, Professor George has suggested that civility should govern moral debate whenever cultural circumstances or other factors make it possible for reasonable people of goodwill to be mistaken about a putative moral evil. And reasonable people can be mistaken about even serious moral evils when ignorance, prejudice, self-interest, and other factors that impair sound moral judgment are prevalent in a culture or subculture. I disagree with that position. First, at least with respect to ideologies that develop a large following, for example, white supremacism, Nazism, Stalinism, cultural circumstances or other factors will usually make it possible for reasonable people of goodwill to be mistaken about a putative moral evil. A second and more important objection is that George and other civilitarians overlook the role that incivilities have played in moving American political culture in a good direction. Moral progress does not just happen. It is made to happen in all sorts of ways, including conduct that is tainted with coercion. Think of any strike or boycott, or aggressiveness. Think of the punitive anti-slavery polemics of my hero, William Lloyd Garrison, or out-and-out violence. Think of John Brown, think of Nat Turner, think of Denmark Vesey, or for that matter, think of Abraham Lincoln's Union Army. Civility can be a virtue. I am willing to say that it is presumptively a virtue. I do not want to be seen as cavalierly dismissing civility and its attendant habits, customs, and sentiments. It is surely worthwhile to investigate ways of minimizing discord, to caution against needless polarization, to encourage self-control, and to praise modesty, considerateness, and the inclination to give others the benefit of the doubt. Still, in a cruel world, all too filled with injustice, civility should be viewed realistically and put in its rightful, limited place.
Randall Kennedy, thank you very much. Randall Kennedy. Jill Lepore, please.
Since the 1960s, during decades when definitions of life and death have been the subject of both medical debate and shifting technological intervention, American politics, animated by an intractable, painful, and now entirely partisan fight over the beginning and the end of life, has been haunted by the specter of death. We can retrace some of those events. In 1972, the phrase sanctity of life for the first time appeared in an opinion of the Supreme Court. The next year, the court issued its ruling in Roe. In 1975, in the Karen and Quinlan case, the right to death and the right to die and the right to life were locked together. We can think about how that has worked in recent politics, of course. All of us have witnessed this during the debate over the Obama health care legislation. The summer Obama proposed that health care reform. Sarah Palin warned that health care would lead to death panels. And Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley agreed that citizens had every right to fear that the government was attempting to pull the plug on grandma. In Washington, street theater activists wore masks inspired by the scream. Just how much our political discourse now concerns matters of life and death can also be illustrated by the more recent fury over Planned Parenthood, which has required presidential nominees to testify their fealty to certain lobbies, which has tied up legislatures and courts in more than half a dozen states, launched a congressional investigation, and nearly led to the shutdown of the federal government, and all this in a single year, 2011 alone. Matters of life and death are not inherently partisan. In the decades since 1965, they have been made so. And here's the crux of the problem. Matters of life and death do not generally have two and only two sides. But we have two and only two parties. Reasonable people on all sides agree that profoundly serious, important, and difficult questions lie at the heart of these matters, but politics cannot answer them, and reasonable people, it appears, do not run political parties. In American politics, life and death are what we're talking about, even when we seem to be talking about something else. And that is why do or die is how we seem so often lately to be talking. Depressingly, not a few interlocutors in these debates give every appearance of insincerity, taking strident positions, but not feeling much of anything, practicing what we might think of as a zombie politics. Thank you.
We've got an email here from Kathleen. I'll read this. And she says, is there a difference between how contemporary liberalism and conservatism look at civility?
The answer would be whether or not conservatives or liberals are in power and feel threatened by the other, they're going to accuse the other of being uncivil.
To wrap up, let's think just for a moment about how those that you all know well from history might look at our moment now. I mean, cast your mind back. If someone, some frock-coated gentleman, or, you know, Constitution-burning William Lloyd Garrison, or, you know, Richard Hofstadter, if he could join us again here today, survey this American milieu today from a great height, you know, listen in to us for a few months and sort of take the measure of it. John, what do you think? Pick your figure, pick your time. What do you think they would think of where we stand now, our discourse today?
I'll pick Frederick Douglass. How would Frederick Douglass view our current moment? He would want an even greater expansion of civil discourse, meaning it would be messier because of the profound silences that exist about, to a certain degree, money in politics, but especially the mass incarceration rate, which is another form. He would see it, I think, as another form of slavery. After all, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, makes an exception for convicted criminals.
To talk about that.
Yes, to talk about that issue. And among developed nations, the United States is off the cliff, off the charts in terms of its mass incarceration. That is, no one is really discussing that in terms of the political discourse.
Randall Kennedy, pick a perspective, a person.
I think that we could canvass our history, bring back any person you'd want, and my comment would be that in many respects, we live actually in a time of more accountability. There is the press, you know, when John F. Kennedy was in the White House, there were whole subjects that were not explored. There were all sorts of questions that were not asked. That's not the case today. People bring up all sorts of things. There are more voices. There's more political participation from wider sectors of the American populace.
The blue dress is waved.
So, well, yes. You know, I mean, there's also an opening for, you know, ridiculousness and more, you know, and distraction. I'm not saying that all that comes to the fore is good. There's a lot of ridiculousness that comes to the fore. I guess I am saying that we should, in my view, cut out the apocalyptic notions that, you know, we are worse off than we've ever been. In many respects, we're better off than we've ever been, including in terms of the way in which people participate in politics and, frankly, understand politics.
Jill Lepore, pick a perspective from the past, from the mists of time.
Well, Benjamin Franklin always said he wished that he could be preserved in a vat of Madeira wine so that he could come and see what the country was like in 2 centuries. But I am a pretty strong believer that the past is behind us and the dead are dead, and this is our world to make.
And this is our world to make. Never mind what they might think of it, it's ours right now.
They can't speak to us in that way.
So let's pick it and take the bit in our teeth and run with it. We will do that today. I'm very grateful to the three of you for getting us started with the perspective of history. John Stouffer, Randall Kennedy, Jill Lepore, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, with a tremendous sense of history at our backs, we plunge forward into this very, very big subject. This session will be civility and morality. It's hard to get much bigger than that. There are big questions here. Is civility a smokescreen to maintain the status quo? Does it encourage conformity and inhibit dissent? Is civility sometimes in conflict with other important moral values, or simply with moral values? This question could a new civility lead to a better informed citizenry? Austin Surratt will kick us off today. Professor Surratt.
I have 2 points to make. One, civility is a secondary, not a primary moral virtue. And second, that we need to be careful to nurture the conditions under which civility can flourish. To illustrate my worry about civility, I want to offer one example of what I would call a pathology of civility. I want to use an example in which the discourse of civility was not used to praise Martin Luther King, but rather to criticize him and to try to domesticate his activities. Birmingham in 1963 was perhaps America's most segregated city. You'll remember that In 1963, King and others came to Birmingham to protest the rampant segregation in Birmingham. They were met by police dogs, they were met by fire hoses, and they were met with the warm embrace of Bull Connor. They wanted to protest. In their own way, they wanted to protest peacefully on Good Friday and on Easter Sunday. They were denied a parade permit, which is one of the legal requirements of civil protest in the United States. And Bull Connor, following a tactic which was then widely used in the South, it wasn't enough just to deny them a parade permit. He went to court and sought an injunction, a legal order, preventing the protests from happening. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had encountered this strategy elsewhere in the South. And in the past, they had complied with those injunctions. But in Birmingham, they said no, they would not comply. They would disobey the law and march on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And so they did, and they were arrested, and they were charged with contempt of court. On the Monday following the Easter protests, King and his lawyers went into the trial court and appealed to the judge not to cite them for contempt, to lift the contempt against them. The judge refused to do so. Standing on the proposition that there is nothing more important than respect for the law, the judge sent them off to jail. Eventually, their case made its way to the United States Supreme Court. Before the case reached the United States Supreme Court, 8 Alabama clergymen, allegedly white moderates, issued a statement condemning the demonstration in terms which would become reminiscent, or they forecast what the United States Supreme Court would say. Listen to these words. Justice Stewart, writing in Walker versus Birmingham, said, "No matter how righteous one's commitment, no matter how just one's cause, respect for the law is a small price to pay for civilization itself." In reading those lines, in thinking about Walker versus Birmingham, I'm reminded of another great thinker of the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse, who wrote an essay on what he called repressive tolerance. He reminded us that tolerance in the face of radical evil is no virtue.
Let me introduce from Boston College, Alan Wolf.
Like many people who write about politics, I've become increasingly fascinated by the ideas of a German political philosopher of the 1920s and 1930s, a man who flirted with and in fact joined the Nazi Party, a man named Carl Schmitt, who's famous for analyzing the realm of politics as essentially based upon what he calls the friend-enemy distinction, that in politics you must treat your opponent as an enemy you would vanquish, that any expression of respect you may give to your opponent in politics is a sign of weakness, that true political action consists in going to the brink of war. And while I certainly think that there are people in American politics who seek victory at almost any cost, who will lie furiously about their opponents, who will spend unimaginable sums of money on negative advertising, who will say you lied during a presidential speech on a hallowed occasion, come nowhere near that standard. After all, if you look at the awfully negative things that, for example, the Republican candidates say to each other in their innumerable debates, let's keep in mind that these are debates, that they're televised, that everyone's watching them, that this is not the realm that happens when politics completely breaks down. So yes, our politics is, in my view, filled with the flaws that Citizens United has opened the door to. But let's keep in perspective what other societies have experienced and recognize the blessings of civility in our own. Thank you so much.
I didn't expect you to be the champion of civility here today. I'm glad we've got one. But let me ask you this. Is it possible, the structure has kind of been put forward. This is broad terms that we get to think big and broad today, that civility may be actually the enemy of morality. But is it possible that in some cases, in some sense, civility is the ladder to morality?
Oh, exactly. I think that's an exceptionally good way to point it. It's, I would think of it as a first step toward some of the other values that at least some people have said can come into conflict with morality. So, for example, if justice comes into conflict, conflict with civility. If justice can come into conflict with civility, which indeed it can, taking the first step of civility can lead toward justice. It's only a first step. But since we can all make first steps, it's one I think we ought to try to make.
We'll talk more about that path. Alan Wolf, thank you very much for your comments right here. And please join me in welcoming David L. Smith of Williams College. David.
This cluster of words, civil, civility, civilization, in its older history, comes from a root that means light. And these are concepts that are about people coming together in cooperation for mutual enlightenment. We've lost that sense of them, except in the word civilization. But as a humanist, it's important to me to be interested in that and to try to bring some consciousness of that back. It's not just about decorum, but it's about the concept that truth, enlightenment, improves the character. And the improvement in character and intelligence makes itself manifest in how people behave. I'm not going to talk at length about Martin Luther King, but the letter from the Birmingham jail is an amazing document because of the way in which he forces his way into a discourse, a public discourse, that is so white supremacist. And when these 8 white ministers challenge him over the question of continuing to protest, of upsetting the community, and so forth, he responds from jail. And he wraps himself in the mantle of St. Augustine and the whole tradition of progressive Christian theology. And so he overturns the sense of authority, which I think he's working as a humanist, rereading history and making the lessons of history available to the public. Not just an activist minister, but a humanist who did his PhD work here in Boston.
Please join me in thanking David L. Smith. Here's an email question from Pam. How much of the change in civility in our democracy is a result of the increased influence of money? I fear that the power of the individual vote is disappearing.
Money for progressives is an issue which should be left behind because it mobilizes almost no one. I think the problem isn't just money and radical inequality, and this names exactly what Alan names. The problem is a political strategy, a conscious political strategy to move issues out of the domain of the incremental and into the domain of the monumental. It's not that the Republicans are any less civil than the Democrats as human beings. They've just understood that they can make political gain by removing issues from the domain that Alan names the incremental or the partial and convert them into arguments about ultimate aims.
Is the first term then of President Barack Obama, Alan Wolf, evidence that civil discourse doesn't work? He came championing it. He gave it a 2004 connection. Let's not be red, let's not be blue. Is it, exhibit A of the limits of civil discourse in our society when the President of the United States cannot successfully, some would say, champion it and act on it and govern with it?
I think he did set himself up for a terrible fall. He didn't recognize that he would be much better off fighting rather than essentially conceding from the beginning. But to his credit, he's learned. And he's now where he should have been 3 years ago. But what? That's progress.
We've got Barack coming in with a tweet saying, Obama, a leader in civil discourse, his rhetoric is not from humility or modesty, but from rather a pompous elitism.
There's a lot of negativity aimed at him because, he's Harvard and he's all of those kinds of, he has that elite pedigree that people resent. and they're especially resented in people of color, and most especially in black men. So to me, that's where that anger comes from.
To David L. Smith, Alan Wolfe, and Austin Sarat, thank you very much for your time today. We're going to begin this session looking at civility and culture. We are a country of many cultures. What about civility in that environment? Our calls for civility, a distraction that marginalizes the individual and inhibits an honest evaluation of absolutes. Does the practice of civility evolve differently in different cultural experiences? Diana Eck. Diana, thank you.
Thank you so very much. What is it that permits that rhetorical slippage from Muslim terrorists to language that deliberately impugns and denigrates Muslims in general? Blacks, Catholics, Jews, gays. During the fall of 2008, this rhetorical slippage was utilized in a national advertising campaign, the massive distribution of 28 million copies of the DVD called Obsession, Radical Islam's War Against the West, a paid advertisement paid for by the Clarion Fund in more than 70 newspapers, 28 million copies, distributed especially in swing states in the 2008 election. The film moves seamlessly through a barrage of violent images, pieced together with the voices of commentators, from speaking of radical Islam to impugning Muslims and Islam generally, with fear-mongering parallels between Muslim terrorists and Nazis. Why, we may ask? Well, it may have had something to do with the election of Barack Obama, indeed, a president who then hosted iftar dinners at the White House and hoped to improve relations with the Muslim world, including that part of the Muslim world that is right here in America. By the midterm elections in the summer of 2010, the simple message, "Stop Islam," had been amplified to "Islam kills" and whatever else is meant by the phrase Barack Akbar. Remember that summer of 2010, a nationwide, ultimately worldwide controversy over the proposed creation of a Muslim community center in Lower Manhattan. Stop the 9/11 mosque was stop the Islamization of America. Stop any mosque. The signage of this civil maelstrom included another word, Sharia, Islamic law, the moral path, the path of Islam. But the signs were pretty ominous looking, scrawled in red as if dripping with blood. One began to see these signs from coast to coast, signaling somehow a barbarity of intention. But why? Why were these Tea Party protesters carrying this profusion of blood-dripping Sharia signs? Nothing but tagging this word as the graffiti of a nationwide Islamophobic campaign. Well, the other side of the discourse was, you might say, civil, no red meat here. Groundless hatred is the real enemy. Say no to hate. When you oppress one, you oppress all.
What is your invitation in this description of a reality in our country? This is a meeting of cultures on that kind of field. What's the invitation here in the context of civil discourse?
I think the invitation is that our encounter with one another in the United States is an encounter that will require much more openness and engagement, and that, that incivility thrives on the level of ignorance that we have of neighbors who are no longer simply neighbors on the other side of the world, but neighbors on the other side of the street. So the challenge is really the challenge of engagement with difference in a society in which difference becomes the seedbed of fear.
Diane Eck, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And next, Mark Lila. Mark, thank you.
I'd like to test everyone's tolerance right now while I make the case against justice. But this view that essentially politics is about movements, struggles, and claims for rights, that's what political life is about, has shaped our intellectual culture, and certainly in universities, the historical profession absolutely, and even the way we some of us conduct ourselves politically. It's led to, and I feel we heard a bit of this morning, it's led to a kind of hyperbolic and homiletic style of speaking about American politics. That's what the history books that our children read today are like. They're homilies. They focus on marginal groups, they focus on struggles for justice, which is part of our history, but they lack context. They lack the context of where that fits into the larger picture of what goes on in American political life. Simply put, justice isn't everything, nor should it be. I understand that American politics was, always raucous and all the rest. But there has been a decline of respect for knowing, simply knowing things in our politics that to me represents a departure given the fact that government, the United States' role in the world is much more complicated and requires much more knowledge to have a useful opinion or to be engaged seriously. That the United States is no longer the semi-backwater it was in the 19th century. Government is no longer a simple thing. It requires all sorts of experts. It requires scientists and accountants and economists and environmentalists. It requires all these sorts of people who have expertise. But there is something that has entered our civic discourse that has been not only indifferent to that, but hostile to it. An idealization of ignorance, a contempt for learning, for science, and for the so-called elites who master them. That for me, and not some of the other things we've been talking about, that to me is the most serious and portentous breakdown in civility in our political lives today.
What is the end, then, of the civil discourse you'd prescribe? What's the end?
Getting it right.
Getting what right?
Well, that's what we talk about, right? That is, if we're going to have a foreign policy that has certain aims, how do we get there? If we're, as a country, have to talk about what our aims are, what do we bring to the table? And we not only bring to the table opinions, we bring knowledge to the table. And that should be the price of entry in the door.
And you mean aims rather than ideals?
Absolutely, instead of ideals. I'm tired of ideals as well. I'm talking about, in the short term, how do we defend and extend our national interests? How do we help to sustain a world order in which nations like ourselves can operate? There's a way of thinking that you're shooting higher by talking about ideals in this matter, and you're shooting much lower. You set the bar too low.
Shift from ideals to aims, and you have to bring information.
That's
or you have
my
nothing
point.
to talk about.
That's my point.
That would be a culture shift. Mark Lilla, thank you very much. Ilan Stavans, please.
There are 50+ million Latinos in the United States. It is an astonishing number. There are more Latinos in the United States than Spaniards in Spain. There are more Latinos in the United States than Canadians in Canada. The number of Latinos in the United States is larger than in most countries of Latin America. Issues of civility have to be projected to understand how these different immigrant groups perceive civility. The majority of the immigrants that have come from Latin America have come escaping dictatorship, escaping political persecution, having a sense that our vote over there does not count. The transition to assimilation is a transition, the transition to America is a transition that has to do with giving up certain visions of the past, certain ways of political representation to engage in new ways. And the question that is often asked is assimilation still taking place in America? Are we still the country that we were prior 1950 or at the end of the 19th century, or when the founding fathers created with this beautiful idea what this country would eventually become? And the fact is, no. Latinos are not integrating the way other groups have integrated in the past. There are pockets in this country that are increasingly large where the spoken language is Spanish, where the spoken language, not only in the classroom, not only at home, but also on the street. There is an intense duality among us Latinos. Do we belong to Latin America or do we belong to the United States? The melting pot has disappeared. The mosaic has come up. And in this new mosaic, the idea of duality is an idea that really sits well among us. In order to change America, we have to change Latinos. But in order to change Latinos, we have to understand who Latinos are. And if we don't do something about it, we are not going to be able to recognize the country in which we live today.
It's a very important lesson right there. Civility begins with recognizing what and who our country is, acknowledging that, and we're glad that you are here to help us do that right now. Take us to a very simple point then. In that recognition, in that acknowledgement, the noun civility and its equivalent in Spanish, or the lack thereof.
There's no word in Spanish for civility. It's as simple as that. There is a word that comes close to it, that is cortesía, which will be courtesy, being courteous to one another. But I don't know if being courteous is to be civil. And the fact that it is absent in one's vocabulary, the fact that our vocabulary in Spanish doesn't present the same terms and the same paradigms is already a beginning to engage us in different ways of perceiving what civility is about.
Question here. Does civility mean toleration? And if so, are there limits to toleration? Are there points of view which society should not or even cannot tolerate? And I guess we may hear in this some particular reference to Islam. Diana?
Well, I don't know. I mean, tolerate has a lot of different sort of senses here. I mean, how much poison can a person tolerate in their system, et cetera, without... I mean, I like toleration as a term. I don't know if it's, you know, a counterpart to civility. It seems to me that we tolerate many things that we know not very much about, and that in a society as vigorously argumentative as ours and as diverse as ours, toleration is just too thin a foundation for our future.
Diana Eck of Harvard, Mark Lilla of Columbia, and Ilan Stavans of Amherst College, thank you very much to all three. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ilan.
Well,
That was fun. All right, now we're in my clubhouse. I know journalists, we're out of the academic woods. Nevertheless, we're going to give them the honor of the podium. I have a feeling they'll be much more brief at it, and then we'll dive right on in. Ellen, you're on.
After the morning of listening to the academics, I'd like to go back for just a few minutes, and journalists do keep to time and space, and talk about a much more everyday version of the civility issue, which thinks about incivility as the angry, polarized voices that we hear. So I'm going to do it in a much more short-run version, which is to say simply that the polarizing of politics has happened in sync with the polarizing of the media, and in some ways those two things are connected. The political commentary in the blogosphere, in the world of Facebook and Twitter, in radio, has become so rigid that many do feel they'd rather win than make the country work. In a Pew study, people blamed radio and TV and reality programs for our uncivil tongues, and there's some truth in that. A lot of people have picked up on the language of talk radio and imitated, or on the anonymity of the internet and of the blogosphere, and that has become a kind of acceptable version of speaking in public. And those of us on the other side of those emails know all about it. So what is wrong with food fight journalism and food fight politics? What Austin Serrett this morning referred to as the battle of the worlds has become the norm. And to me, it's not just impoliteness, some mismanners violation that is the problem with it. It's that everyone is now required in the public to be so certain and so simplistic. There is no immediate penalty that I can see for a politician turning a deficit debate into a character assassination, and there is no penalty for reducing complexity into a tweet. There are all kinds of serious arguments about church and state or about reducing the deficit versus surplus spending, but rather than hear the complexities, we hear people hurling certainties at each other. One last thing, I think the rise of incivility has gone hand in hand with the rise of disinformation. Opinion and ideology now trumped facts, and we don't even agree on facts. And if we can't agree on facts, how can we have a civil conversation? So journalism is supposed to be about keeping us connected, keeping us in touch, letting us know what we need to know to decide about that fragile thing called democracy. And it is the connections that seem so fragile now, even at a time when Americans are really struggling to think of ourselves as a single people who are in it together.
Ellen Goodman, we're so glad you're here. Thank you. Joe Klein.
I came back from Afghanistan, a trip to Afghanistan a couple of years ago, and realized that I'd been spending more time in the Middle East than in the Middle West. And I decided to do an old-fashioned journalistic thing, which was to get into a car and drive across the country and talk to people. And I've now done this twice, and I did it in a new way. In fact, I didn't even know the name of what I was doing. It has a new name. I was crowdsourcing it. I put out an all-points bulletin to Time readers and to CNN viewers and said, look, here's the route. If you got someone interesting you want me to meet, you want me to meet your coworkers or your neighbors or whatever, let's do it. And I would do a town meeting almost every day. They ranged from one person who had put out 5,000 resumes trying to get a job. He was in Chicago, to 70 people in Yuba City, California. And the one thing that comes through these town meetings is that they can't stand us. I mean, they really hate the media, and rightly so. They feel that they are not represented. My most recent trip was going south to north from Laredo to Minnesota, and in southern states like Arkansas, Texas, Missouri's kind of border, people were kind of amazed by all the attention that we were giving the Tea Party. To them, the Tea Party people were the local lunatics who were always, clogging up town meetings and talking about, the fact that evolution shouldn't be taught in the schools. And the greatest change I've seen in our business over the last 40 years has been the shift from our natural, proper skepticism to cynicism. The toughest story for a political reporter to write is a positive story about a politician. And I've developed an aphorism, and I'll leave you with this. Cynicism is what passes for insight among the mediocre.
Joe Klein, thank you very much. Thank you, Joe. Kathleen Parker, please.
It's difficult to talk about the media because it's not a monolithic entity anymore. We are all media. And one of the things that has changed significantly that I think has led to this lack of civility in the public square, and this is something that both of these mentioned, or at least touched on, the technology, the technological enablement of people to connect does two things. Number one, it allows them to speak quickly and without thought. Number two, it allows us to balkanize and to find, we congregate in sort of ideological cubicles where we find people of like mind, and we never have to actually meet and talk with one another. But it has another effect, I think, which is that when you are with your kind, the rest of the world becomes the other. And we got to know that little word during the 2008 campaign when the far right was often referring to President Obama, well, not yet as president, but Barack Obama, as that guy, or he was characterized frequently as the other. Essentially what we do in that case is we objectify the person, we dehumanize them, and that makes it much easier to say things that we would never say to someone's face. When I get these horrible emails, and I get thousands a week, they're not all horrible, but a good many of them are, and people say things that you just can't even imagine, you know? I think, really? I mean, I personally have a sign on my computer that says, do not drink and send. Every now and then I'll read one just out of curiosity. And if I take the time to respond, and I do it in a civil way, I mean, I'm not going to get in an argument with these people, but I'll write back and say, gosh, I'm sorry you didn't like the column. Must have had a hard day. They will invariably write back in a human fashion, apologetically, and say, I'm so sorry, I don't know why I said that. My point is simply that when we do recognize each other as fellow human beings, we treat each other better, clearly.
Kathleen Parker, thank you very much. Kathleen Parker, thank you. Thank you. Ellen, our clock is running out on us here.
I just wasn't going to accept the premise that the extreme right and the extreme left are equally extreme, because the left has moved so far, it's now the extreme right versus what used to be called left center, just to make that, you know, the whole system has moved, but we still think of it. But there is also a journalistic bias, which I would fight, but a journalistic bias to have an other hand. In other words, you know, on the one hand, we interview a person who's you know, pro-chipmunks, and now we have to find somebody who's opposed to chipmunks. It's the way the media literally created Phyllis Schlafly as the anti-feminist in the 70s, and it's the we seem to need two, and by the way, only two sides to any issue.
Two of every kind. Ellen, look, we've just got a minute here. Look for the light with us for a second. Pull out those threads that may turn or are turning the country back toward a more civil discourse, and not a weak tea civil discourse, but a vigorous, rich one that doesn't duck big moral issues, one that really engages, one that engages all the cultures and all the sectors of our society. What are the elements in the media or beyond that may take us there?
Well, I'm not Ms. Hopeful, but I would say that the counter side to all the horrible, you know, nasty emails that Kathleen gets, that I've gotten, that Joe gets, is that out there is a group of engaged people, many of whom are going to their own worlds, where their own online communities, where they do literally discuss something fully. And let us hope that they go from there to bring it into the larger world where the rest of us are living. But there is a lot of fermenting, thoughtful, small community civil conversation going on.
Be your own media, and maybe on the back of that we cross this river. I'm very grateful to the three of you for being with us. It's been an incredible day of investigation and exploration. To all of you in the hall here and around the country, this day on civil discourse and American democracy comes to a close. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen Goodman, Joe Klein, Kathleen Parker. Thank you. Thank you.